A pregnant woman strapped to a table, her belly sliced open, without anesthesia and not for a C-section. Amputation and reattachment of limbs to the wrong sides of the body. If you thought the Nazi experiments were crazy, wait till you hear about the Unit 731. In this two-part series, we'll share the most horrifying experiments you cannot even imagine being part of the horror movies. The stories you'll hear get progressively worse, so you want to see the part 2. But now, horrifying experiments. Part 1. It's 1936 and an innocent epidemic prevention and water purification agency was established in Harbin, now China, but previously colonized and ruled by Japan. It had a noble goal: to conduct research about how the human body could withstand hunger and thirst, and fight diseases. Early experiments were conducted on volunteers who had signed consent waivers. However, as the war intensified, their methods changed. What's worse, being infected with the plague, being dissected alive, or being used as a human guinea pig for real frostbite experiments. For the victims of Unit 731, this wasn't a hypothetical question. It was their reality. And they didn't care who you were, a male, female, or a child. Everybody got the same treatment. Researchers led by a well-respected leader, Lieutenant General 𝐟𝐫𝐫𝐫 Ishii, started calling their victims Maruta, meaning logs. This chilling linguistic trick allowed them to distance themselves from the horrific nature of their experiments, which we're about to dive in now. Viewer discretion is advised. Number 1. Experiments with water and blood. The researchers were determined to push the human body to its absolute limits. For example, how long can a person survive without water? Unit 731 was hell-bent on finding out. Prisoners were subjected to controlled dehydration experiments. At first, they just felt thirsty and had a dry mouth, as maybe you've experienced. But then eyes started to shrink, skin dried out, and extreme lethargy, confusion, and fainting followed. Severe lack of fluid and electrolytes caused brain and organ failure. The victims' bodies were slowly mummified as they begged for even a drop of water. Some were left to suffer for days, their organs shutting down one by one as researchers meticulously documented their decline. The sheer number and variety of experiments conducted at Unit 731 are staggering. Prisoners were also hung upside down to observe the effects of blood pooling in their brains. Respiratory failure, loss of vision, strokes, and brain hemorrhages were a casualty. You were lucky if you lost consciousness, but that wasn't the only experiment with blood. Other victims were injected with animal blood, their bodies rejecting the foreign substance as researchers watched with clinical detachment. The human body is not equipped to handle this, making such an injection highly toxic and life-threatening. As one researcher chillingly noted, some experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or of medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? An estimated 14,000 people were murdered within its walls, with potentially 300,000 more deaths from their infectious disease experiments, which we'll cover later in this video. But now, let's look at the next set of experiments that are worse than what we just covered. Number 2. Real-time frostbite experiments. What would you do if you were a researcher and wanted to know about the effects of frostbite on humans? Most probably not what they did during World War II. Their cause was noble: to develop effective treatments for their brave men fighting on the battlefields, sometimes facing freezing conditions, particularly in Siberia. The winters in Harbin were extremely harsh, with temperatures often plummeting well below freezing. This provided an excellent environment for human testing. Prisoners were taken outside and made to stand with bare limbs exposed to the cold. The toes and feet, fingers and hands would be allowed to freeze completely. Sometimes the process was accelerated by first immersing limbs in cold water and then exposing them to the frigid air until their skin and flesh froze solid. They endured excruciating pain and extreme suffering. Researchers also experimented with various defrosting methods: rapid rewarming, gradual rewarming, and worst, using open flames causing severe burns. Think that's cruel? Wait till you hear what I'm about to share now. In some particularly gruesome experiments, once the limbs were frozen solid, they would be struck with objects like sticks or clubs to test the brittleness of the frozen tissue and bone. Human beings who were still alive could see their hands and feet shattered similar to ice, and those were men, women, and children. For many, the psychological torture was as brutal as the physical pain. Amputation was common for those who survived the initial experiment, as the tissue often became necrotic and gangrenous. Many others died from the trauma, shock, or secondary infections caused by the frostbite and subsequent treatment methods. Number 3. Experiments with the deadliest diseases. Imagine being infected with plague, typhus, or cholera. Fever, chills, and weakness in the body are nothing compared to abdominal bleeding and pain, nausea and vomiting, skin and tissue death, and feelings of suffocation. All the symptoms of plague. You were lucky if you were infected with typhus. The high fever and intense headache could make you feel extremely unwell, weak, and disoriented. The mental fog and confusion might have made you feel unease, but at least you didn't see your limbs turning black and dying while you were still alive. All these diseases cause intense suffering and can be fatal if not treated promptly. But that was just the beginning. As the illnesses took hold, you'd be strapped to a table, fully conscious, as researchers cut you open to observe the effects of the disease on your living organs. This wasn't a horror movie. It was daily life at Unit 731. But the true horror lies in its scale and ambition. Under the leadership of Dr. 𝐟𝐨𝐫𝐫, the unit produced enough plague bacteria to potentially kill the world's population multiple times over. They developed bombs filled with plague-infected fleas, which were dropped on Chinese villages, turning entire communities into laboratories for germ warfare studies. But the torment didn't end there. Number 4. Pressure chamber and chemical weapon experiments. The cruelty knew no bounds. Prisoners were also exposed to extreme pressures and chemicals, pushing them beyond human tolerance. Pressure chambers, also known as decompression chambers, simulate conditions of extremely high or low atmospheric pressure. The experiments conducted by Unit 731 focused on observing how the human body reacted to rapid changes in pressure. Intense pain, tissue damage, and the rupture of organs were witnessed. Sometimes the victims got paralyzed, sometimes they experienced seizures, and sometimes their eyes simply popped out of their sockets, eardrums ruptured, and their intestines burst. This wasn't science fiction, it was the reality for countless victims of Unit 731. Prisoners were also subjected to various poison gases, including mustard gas and cyanide gas, to develop better chemical weapons and protective measures. Prisoners were placed in sealed chambers designed to contain specific concentrations of poison gases. The chambers varied in size. Some were small enough to house one person, while others could accommodate multiple prisoners, allowing the researchers to study the effects of different exposure levels and durations on individuals or groups. If you were in there, you could have felt intense pain, swelling, blindness, shortness of breath, and seizures among other symptoms. People screaming right next to you, or in chambers around you. One former member of Unit 731, haunted by his experiences, admitted, "I cannot forget these things ever." He spoke of innocent victims, including children, their screams echoing through the halls of the facility. In some cases, victims were killed intentionally after exposure to study the internal effects of the gases on organs, tissues, and cells. As we emerge from the shadows of these horrific experiments, we're left with a chilling realization. The progression from medical neglect to deliberate torture shows how easily ethical boundaries can crumble. But these were just the start. In part 2 of this series, we'll share experiments that are even worse than those that you heard today. Dissecting people alive, burning them, and targeting them with war weapons are just a fraction of it all. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and hit that like button for this video to spread.